In just 2 nights of play, this rising poker star Action Dan went from huge profits and mounting momentum to massive losses and an uncertain future in poker. In this video, we see how this all unfolded, including the unlucky hands and huge coolers leading to massive tilt and straight up punts totaling $1.4 million.
Great call.
In the first $1 million game, we start off with one of the most technically interesting hands versus legend Tom Dwan. Action Dan raises from the hijack with ace-9 of hearts to 3k, and Tom 3-bets from the button to 13k with 6-5 of hearts. Given his name, Action Dan will not stand for this. He 4-bets to 42k, and Tom calls.
And 6-5 suited. A hand that plays extremely well versus a 4-bet range. When you 3-bet this hand, it pretty much never folds.
With just this hand, we will analyze it using a poker solver called GTO Wizard. As we can see from these ranges, ace-9 suited is a bit wide, as we prefer the smaller suited ace-x straight combos, but when up against a fellow GTO wizard like Tom, it's completely fine to widen. The flop is dangerous for him, as we see Jack-Jack-3 with 2 hearts, so both flopping a flush draw, but Tom on the bad side of things. Action Dan makes a c-bet for 31k into 87k. Tom responds by raising to 115k.
I like this raise. Action Dan very likely to be range betting flop.
The solver likes this, as these guys are playing infinitely deep. Of course, with Dan's exact holding, he is going nowhere. If they were playing shorter stacked, like 100 to even 200 big blinds deep, Tom should never raise here, as all of the money can get into the middle naturally. But being so deep, as mentioned by the commentator, his raise is good. It eliminates the c-bets that fold to any aggression like ace-king and so on. But let's see what happens as both players have huge hands.
Action Dan's going nowhere. 318,000. Going to a turn. Lock in.
Check.
Rick to the board. Knuckle.
Check, check.
Now Dan checks, and surprisingly, we see a check back from Tom. This is the point in the hand where Tom makes a non-approved solver play. After raising the flop, what hands should he be checking back here? Well, not many. Tom should be betting about 70% of his range. I would have really loved to see a big bet from Tom. Action Dan will often just have to fold even his best flush draws like he has here. If Action Dan calls, Tom can just give up on the river. Anyways, the river is the ace of spades. This is a really good run out for Dan, so when he checks to Tom, Tom has to naturally just give up. Or does he?
Durr left with 6 high in a 300k pot. Does he pull the trigger? Would be targeting hands like kings. Knuckle. Action Dan wins it, 318,000. Durr with a sigh of relief that the heart did not come.
Could have been painful. Interesting if you would have bet the river.
That non-turn bet really killed him, and Dan faced no more aggression and wins with a pair of aces.
I'm saying if I bet 200k or something, he's gonna cry, be sad, and call. Like, what can he do?
If you enjoyed these screenshots and brief GTO explanations, remember they came from a poker training program called GTO Wizard. Elite players like Tom Dwan and many others use it for a reason. Get 10% off your first purchase with the link in my bio and comment section. Dan may have gotten off easy there, as Dwan decided to give up, but I don't think things will be so easy versus this crazy rich Asian businessman, Peter. We start as there is a raise from the hijack to 4k and a couple calls. Dan squeezes from the big blind to 23k. There is better hands to do this with other than queen check off, but in this game, it's almost the same as ace queen. Peter is the only caller with his pocket fours. I really don't understand this check from Dan here. You have the range advantage, you block strong kings like king queen, king jack, and you can represent clubs if they come. Just bet. Anyways, he checks and Peter checks back. The turn comes the 5 of spades.
Pretty decent card for Peter now. However, spade and club in Action Dan's hand, and that justifies a bet. Delayed c-bet, 35,000.
Peter with a gut shot to a straight is going nowhere and happily makes a call. The river is the king of diamonds. Not a great card. Much harder to rep a king now. Dan, however, finds the bet for
90 large.
That's right, 90k into 127k. A big bet, but is it big enough? Peter is not the type of guy to fold, as we will see, and it doesn't take long for him to call.
Picks it off. Nice call, Peter. 300,000 going your way. Pocket fours.
Bro.
Nice call.
Really good hero call by Peter here, which just might set up an interesting dynamic between these two for the rest of the game. Next up, these boys are back at it. Peter opens from the cutoff with ace-6 off, and Dan 3-bets to 20k from the small blind with king 3 of hearts. The flop comes king high, but it is a tough one to navigate as we see all clubs. That said, Dan does decide to c-bet small for 12k. Peter with the nut flush draw ace of clubs is happy to come along. The turn comes the queen of hearts. Action Dan now slows down and checks, which I think is really good. If he bets here and gets called, he is basically in no man's land on the river. Peter checks back quickly and the river is the 6 of diamonds. Action Dan now goes for value, betting 45k into 67k. It's certainly kind of thin, but I'm guessing he's going for value versus a 9 or 10s or jacks or maybe a random queen. But Peter has a secret weapon, that ace of clubs.
Wow. Comes with raise. Attacking the weak value bets from Action Dan. Hands like this. Now Dan has to think, how often is Peter checking back flushes on the turn? Probably doesn't expect him to raise hands like 2-pair. This is mostly just going to be flushes or bubbles.
I also think this is really good. Dan doesn't take too long though before calling.
Call. Got him. An almost $500,000 pot. Going to Action Dan.
What? Really good hero call. Great hand by both, but just a bit more by Dan giving him the win. The score is now 1-1 between these two, but who's keeping track?
Take it down.
In the last big hand of the night, Dan is up against Texas Mike. Both players have very sexy hands. Dan with 7-6 of diamonds and Mike with king queen of spades. There is a straddle on for 4k, so Dan makes it 10k to go. Mike 3-bets from the cutoff to 33k. Dan makes a call and we are off to the races with a juicy one. Jack 9-8 2 spades. So Dan has a double gutter straight draw while Mike has an even bigger draw with a straight flush draw. Action checks over to him and he bets 49k into 70k.
This man, Texas Mike, is just on another level, man.
Dan calls unknowingly with very little equity. The turn is the king of diamonds, giving Dan a flush draw of his own. When Dan checks, this time Mike checks back. The river is the 10 of spades. LOL, Mike has a straight flush. No big deal. And well, Dan, he's left with 7 high. So he's got a bet, right?
Right into Texas Mike, straight flush.
All in?
All of it.
Down.
Crazy.
Oh, shit.
The straight flush?
Yeah.
Good balance.
Good thing you didn't have the nut flush.
Action Dan's nightmare comes to an end, for today at least, as he loses over 400k on day 1 of the $1 million game. Little does he know, but things are just getting started. He comes back for day 2, and funny enough, his first big hand is with 7-6 again. This time of spades. Things start off as he raises pre-flop and gets called from 2 other players, Steve and Doug Polk. The flop, all things considered, isn't that bad. He's got middle pair. He bets 7k into 15k. Just Doug makes a call with bottom pair and Steve folds. The turn is exciting. The 8 of hearts. Dan is now open-ended for a straight, but Doug now also has more equity with a flush draw.
Doug now with a flush draw to go along with his pair of 5s, but he is still behind. And as you can see, a 2-to-1 dog to win the hand if it goes to showdown.
Dan puts out a hefty pot-sized bet of 30k, and Doug just calls.
And Action Dan goes 30,000 pot-sized bet here on the turn. Of course, picks up a straight draw to go along with his pair.
The river is money for Dan as we see the 9 of spades making his straight. Perfecto. He overbets, but Doug has nothing by now and quickly makes a fold. Score 1 for the good guys to start the night off. Next up, Doug goes for revenge as he has queen jack of clubs in the big blind. Action Dan opens to 3k from the button with the superior king queen of diamonds. Tom Juan calls with 9-7 suited from the small blind, and Doug 3-bets from the big blind to 18k. Both Dan and Tom make the call. The flop comes Jack 3-3, 2 diamonds for Dan, but top pair for Doug, and nothing for Tom, so he gets out of there. Doug bets small and Dan calls. The turn is the 3 of clubs. Now any pair is a full house, and Dan's flush draw becomes far more weak. When Doug bets 73k into 92k, Dan doesn't take too long before folding.
I mean, at this point, it's really close.
Let's see if Dan can bring things back with ace-8 off from the cutoff. Hands in the big blind makes a call for 3K with 10-6 of hearts, and we go heads up to a great flop for hands of 9-7 for 2 hearts. He checks and Dan wisely checks back. The turn starts to bring some light to Dan's unpromising future of this hand as he picks up a gut shot. Hands, however, is the one betting, putting 3K in. Dan decides to start semi-bluffing here, which personally I don't really like. It's not often you should be using ace high as a bluff, especially when flop goes check check. Sure, you have an 8, so you are blocking the straights, but what hands is hands folding? Anyways, hands calls in the river is the 3 of diamonds. This makes it so there is 4 cards to a straight. With 36K in the pot, Dan continues with his bluff and bets 28K. I'm sure he's trying to make it look like he's going for value, but this just isn't big enough.
But he makes the call.
While it does make hands think about it for a while, he makes the correct hero call. While this one wasn't a huge pot, lots of these smaller sized ones can add up and wreak havoc on someone's soul. Someone else that can do this is a guy named Peter. Remember their record of 1-1? Well, that's about to change in a big way. Peter opens the button with King 7 suited and Dan 3 bets from the small blind with 7-7 to 11K. Steve comes along in the big blind and the flop is action. King 7-4. Peter with 2 pair, but Dan with middle set. Unreal. Action Dan, to his credit, wastes no time building this pot as he bets 18K. Peter does not decide to slow play and raises to 68K. Dan just calls and the turn is a 4 of diamonds and he boats up. If the flush comes in, this is now no worries.
Peter can still beat ace king, king queen, but he does lose the aces.
He checks and Peter bets big. $150,000 into $169,000. Dan once again just calls, and the river is sickening.
Unbelievable. Oh my. I spoke too soon. It just continues to go well for Peter as he runs as hot as the sun.
The king of hearts. Dan checks and Peter bets $250,000.
What does he do with ace king? Small blind versus big blind. Should have won an enormous pot, but somehow Peter wriggles free, and now we have a $719,000 pot, $250,000 to call. A pot just under $1 million, and look at that smile. Oh, unreal. Steve just shaking his head. King 7 versus 7s.
Safe to say this was the hand that broke the camel's back. 2-1 Peter, and that was all she wrote. From here, it seemed like Dan was trying to give his money away. He attempted a 5-bet. Yes, you heard that right. 5-bet bluff pre-flop versus Tom Dwan for $129K. That obviously did not work.
Tom Dwan picks up $132,000 without even seeing a flop.
Then he'd go after Steve, of all people, in a huge spot, lessening his already wounded stack for over $100K.
And he's going to dial up what looks like a monster raise. Fumbling his chips. And a snap call. Definition of a snap call. Steve makes it. And Action Dan punts off $135,000. He went for it. See the wry smile crossing his face.
I don't know how you guys can take so. I just can't think for that long. I just have to Band-Aid it.
Thought we were done? Nope. Dan decides to 3-bet 8-5 suited from the small blind versus hands with complete air and no need for details. Dan bets pot and gets called down by hands, who has ace high. They don't call him hero call hands for nothing. Oh wait.
And he's gonna fold, and Rampage gets it through. Oh my God.
Never mind. All while this is happening, Action Dan's nemesis Peter is picking up his chips. Well, Dan's chips, really, depending on which way you look at it, and leaving. This just had to add extra salt on the wound.
What the fuck? Hands like his ace highs. Ace high super pro. What the fuck? Great call. I didn't come to fold this year. Oh, is this all, like, this is an overreaction to the fucking set from last year? Now you're like, I'm calling with a high card. Fuck you all.
Dan,
looks shell-shocked to me. His demeanor quite different than what we typically see from him on the show.
Dan is finally left with 122K and plays pocket 8s on the button. He 3-bets versus Steve's open with 4s and gets called. But the flop comes 9-4-3, giving Steve a set.
Action Dan.
That's like 80.
His rough night continues. Fires 16,000.
Call.
Steve makes the call and quads for Steve.
Turn, Steve leads for 1K. Okay. And Dan just calls. River, Steve puts Dan all in.
Shoves. Dan with not a lot behind, but enough that this is still an overbet. Dan probably in his head a little bit. Very rough day and week. Makes the call. Gets shown the bad news. Steve is going to stack Action Dan.
Dan does think it over, but just like that, we say our goodbyes.
Good game, guys.
It sounds like
Yeah, man. That was a brutal beat. Yeah.
Dan is going to be done for the night.
What a rough ending for Action Dan, who for almost 3 months now has still not been heard from. Now, I'm not saying he's missing and we need to send out a search party. I'm just saying hopefully he didn't have too much of his own action here and can stomach the $1.4 million loss. But only time will tell. My best guess is he is just taking some time off and will be back on stream when he's ready. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Peace. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you are still here, you are a real one. Just want to let you know I am having a meetup game tomorrow, September 1st at 9 p.m. EST. I'll be playing on Clubs Poker, as well as a tournament on Labor Day, Monday, where I'll have a $100 bounty on my head. Come get it. I'll be streaming. It'll all be lots of fun.